I'm Eliza, 34, and this is the story of how one family dinner changed everything between me and my husband's family forever. Before I go deeper into my story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. If you've ever stood your ground when someone failed to see your worth, feel free to let me know below. And if these kinds of stories speak to you, you're welcome to follow the channel for more. For 7 years, I had been living what most people would consider a contradiction. On the surface, I appeared to be the stereotypical housewife. Home during the day, no traditional office job, no business cards to hand out at family gatherings. But beneath that carefully maintained facade was a reality that even my husband didn't fully grasp. I ran a successful consulting firm from our home office, working with clients across 3 different time zones, managing projects that generated more income than most of his family members made in their conventional careers. The irony wasn't lost on me. While they saw me as unemployed, I was often working 12-hour days, just not in the way they understood work to look like. My laptop was my office, my phone was my conference room, and my dining table had hosted more important business meetings via video call than most corporate boardrooms. But try explaining that to people who equate professional success with a daily commute and a corner office. My husband Michael's family had never quite known what to make of me. When we first got married, I had been transitioning out of my corporate marketing job to start my own business. The timing was unfortunate. Right. As I was building my client base, we were also getting to know each other's families better. They saw the departure from my corporate role, but missed the beginning of something much more significant. Michael's sister Rebecca had appointed herself as the family's unofficial keeper of judgments, and I had become her favorite target. Rebecca worked as a mid-level manager at a healthcare company, the kind of job that came with a badge, set hours, and predictable paychecks. In her world, that represented stability and success. My world of flexible schedules, client calls at odd hours, an income that fluctuated based on project cycles looked like chaos to her, or worse, like laziness disguised as entrepreneurship. The comments had started small. Little digs about how nice it must be to have so much free time. Questions about when I planned to get a real job. Jokes about how lucky I was to have Michael supporting me. Each comment was delivered with a smile, wrapped in the kind of faux concern that made it difficult to address directly without seeming defensive or ungrateful. Over the years, these comments had worn me down in ways I hadn't fully acknowledged until recently. I found myself second-guessing my choices, wondering if I should have stayed in the corporate world just to avoid the judgment. There were nights when I'd lie awake, thinking about how to explain my work to people who had already decided it wasn't legitimate. The mental energy I spent worrying about their opinions could have been channeled into growing my business even further. Michael loved his family deeply, and I respected that. But his loyalty to them sometimes blinded him to how their treatment affected me. When I tried to talk to him about Rebecca's comments, he'd minimize them or suggest I was being too sensitive. He'd say things like, "That's just how Rebecca is," or "She doesn't mean anything by it." But intention doesn't erase impact, and the impact was slowly eroding my confidence and my sense of belonging in his family. The complicated part was that I genuinely cared about these people, despite their judgment. Michael's parents were kind-hearted, individuals who had raised good children, even if those children had some blind spots about different paths to success. His younger brother was pursuing his PhD in engineering, and the family celebrated every milestone of his academic journey. His cousins were teachers, nurses, and accountants, all respectable professions that fit neatly into society's expectations of what work should look like. But I had chosen a different path, and that path didn't come with the external validation that traditional employment provided. There were no performance reviews, no Employee of the Month awards, no company picnics where I could network with colleagues. My successes were measured in client satisfaction, project completion, and yes, financial growth, but none of that was visible to people who didn't understand my industry. I had built my consulting firm specializing in digital marketing strategy for small to medium-sized businesses. My clients were spread across the country, from a boutique jewelry designer in Oregon to a family-owned restaurant chain in Texas. I helped them navigate the digital landscape, develop their online presence, and create marketing campaigns that actually converted browsers into buyers. It was challenging, creative work that I was genuinely passionate about. The flexibility of my schedule meant I could be present for the important moments in Michael's and my life together. I could attend his work functions, be available when he needed support during stressful periods, and yes, I could keep our home running smoothly. But somehow, this had been interpreted as leisure rather than the strategic life choice it actually was. As the years passed, I found myself retreating from family gatherings, making excuses to avoid situations where I knew the judgment would surface. I started to dread the inevitable questions about my work, knowing that my explanations would be met with polite confusion at best and dismissive comments at worst. I was tired of defending my choices to people who had already made up their minds about my worth based on their limited understanding of my life. The dinner that changed everything had been planned for weeks. It was Rebecca's birthday celebration, and Michael had insisted we attend despite my reservations. I had spent the morning working on a particularly complex project for a client, the kind of strategic planning that required deep focus and creative problem-solving. By the time I needed to get ready for dinner, I was mentally exhausted, but professionally satisfied, a combination that would prove to be both my vulnerability and my strength that evening. Looking back now, I realized that dinner was inevitable. The tension had been building for years, and something had to give. I just never imagined it would unfold the way it did, or that the resolution would come from such an unexpected source. The pattern of judgment hadn't emerged overnight. It had been carefully constructed over years of family gatherings, each comment building upon the last until they created a narrative about who I was supposed to be versus who I actually was. The most painful part wasn't the obvious criticism. It was the subtle erosion of my identity within their family structure, the way I slowly became the cautionary tale of what happens when you don't follow conventional paths. It started at our first Thanksgiving together as a married couple. I remember sitting at the dinner table, still glowing from our honeymoon, when Rebecca asked what I was planning to do, now that the wedding excitement was over. When I explained that I was starting my own consulting business, the table went quiet for a moment before the questions began. How would I find clients? Wasn't it risky to leave a stable job? Did I have a business plan? What if it didn't work out? At the time, I thought they were showing genuine concern. I answered each question thoroughly, explaining my market research, my financial projections, my strategy for building a client base. Michael's father nodded politely. His mother smiled encouragingly, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. Rebecca, however, was more direct in her skepticism. She suggested I should keep my corporate job at least part-time as a safety net, implying that my business venture was more of a hobby than a serious career move. That conversation set the tone for every family interaction that followed. At Christmas, Rebecca asked how the little business was going. At Easter, she wondered if I had considered going back to regular work yet. During summer barbecues, she'd make comments about how nice it must be to set my own schedule, with the kind of emphasis that made it clear she thought I was setting very loose schedules indeed. The comments evolved as my business actually began to succeed. Instead of acknowledging my growth, Rebecca shifted her focus to questioning the sustainability of what I was building. She'd ask probing questions about my income stability, whether I was saving enough for retirement without employer benefits, if I felt guilty about not contributing to household expenses the way a traditional wife should. Each question was framed as concern, but the underlying message was always the same. What I was doing wasn't legitimate, stable, or valuable enough to be considered real work. Michael's parents were subtler in their judgment, but it was there nonetheless. They'd ask about my day in the kind of tone people use when they're humoring a child's pretend game. When I'd mention client meetings or project deadlines, they'd nod and change the subject to ask Michael about his job at the engineering firm. His accomplishments were celebrated with enthusiasm, while mine were acknowledged with polite disinterest. The Worst part was how the judgment affected my relationship with Michael himself. Initially, he had been supportive of my business venture, but as his family's skepticism wore on him, I noticed changes in how he talked about my work. He stopped mentioning my successes to his family. When they made comments about my employment status, he'd laugh them off instead of defending me. Gradually, he began echoing some of their concerns in private conversations with me. I remember one particularly painful evening when Michael came home from his brother's engagement party, an event I had skipped because I had a crucial client presentation the next morning. He told me that Rebecca had spent the evening talking about how sad it was that I couldn't prioritize family events because I was playing business owner. When I explained that the presentation was for a major client that could lead to a 6-figure contract, Michael sighed and said maybe Rebecca had a point about my priorities being skewed. That night marked a turning point in how I handled the family judgment. I realized that explaining myself was futile, because they had already decided what my work was worth. They weren't interested in understanding the complexity of running a consulting business, the skill required to manage multiple client relationships, or the financial success I was achieving. They had created a story about me being the irresponsible wife with delusions of entrepreneurship, and no amount of evidence to the contrary would change that narrative. The isolation that followed was profound. I began declining family invitations more frequently, using work as an excuse, which only reinforced their belief that I was using my fake business to avoid family responsibilities. When I did attend gatherings, I'd sit quietly while they discussed their jobs, their promotions, their workplace challenges. If anyone asked about my work, I'd give vague answers and redirect the conversation, tired of having my professional life treated as entertainment, or worse, as a topic for concerned intervention. Michael's cousin Jennifer was particularly cruel in her passive aggression. She worked as a nurse and took every opportunity to contrast her service to others with my self-serving business pursuits. She'd make comments about how fulfilling it was to have a job that truly mattered, to work with people face-to-face instead of hiding behind a computer screen. She'd ask if I ever missed the satisfaction of having colleagues, of being part of a team working towards something bigger than personal profit. The financial aspect of their judgment was perhaps the most insulting, because they couldn't see my income. There were no pay stubs to display, no salary announcements to make. They assumed I wasn't making much money. Rebecca once suggested that Michael and I should consider moving to a smaller place since we were essentially living on one income. Another time, she offered to help me find job openings at her company, complete with a detailed explanation of their benefits package and advancement opportunities. What they didn't know was that my business had been consistently out-earning Michael's salary for the past 3 years. I was contributing significantly more to our household expenses, our savings, and our investment accounts. But because this success didn't come packaged in the traditional format they recognized, it didn't count in their assessment of my worth or contribution to the marriage. The emotional toll of being constantly underestimated began affecting my work performance. I found myself working longer hours, taking on more challenging projects, pushing for bigger contracts, not because I needed to for business reasons, but because I was desperately trying to prove something to people who would never acknowledge my achievements anyway. I was burning myself out in pursuit of validation from individuals who had already decided I wasn't worthy of respect. The breaking point came 6 months before the dinner that would change everything. Michael's grandmother had passed away, and during the funeral reception, Rebecca made a comment about how lucky I was to have a flexible schedule that allowed me to attend family events during the workday. The implication was that people with real jobs had made sacrifices to be there, while I had simply rearranged my leisure time. I excused myself to the bathroom and cried tears of frustration and exhaustion. That night, I made a decision that would prove crucial to my emotional survival. I stopped trying to prove myself to them. I stopped explaining my work, stopped defending my choices, stopped engaging with their judgment at all. If they wanted to believe I was unemployed and irresponsible, that was their choice. I would focus my energy on the people who actually valued my contributions, my clients, my business partners, and hopefully, eventually, my husband. This decision brought me peace, but it also created distance. The less I tried to prove myself, the more convinced they became that there was nothing to prove. My silence was interpreted as confirmation of their suspicions rather than evidence of my dignity and self-respect. By the time Rebecca's birthday dinner arrived, we had reached a stalemate that felt both sustainable and deeply sad. I had no idea that everything was about to change in the most unexpected way possible. The restaurant Rebecca had chosen for her birthday celebration was one of those upscale establishments that screamed success, the kind of place where the menu didn't list prices and the waitstaff spoke in hushed, reverent tones about wine pairings. As Michael and I walked through the heavy glass doors, I felt that familiar knot forming in my stomach. The one that always appeared when I knew I'd be spending the evening defending my existence to people who had already made up their minds about me. Rebecca had reserved a private dining room naturally. She loved being the center of attention, and a separate space would ensure that her birthday celebration could unfold without the distraction of other diners. The room was elegant in that understated way that whispered old money. Dark wood paneling, soft lighting, and a table set for 12 with more silverware than seemed necessary for one meal. Michael's parents, David and Margaret, were already seated when we arrived, looking distinguished and comfortable in their retirement. David had been a successful architect before retiring, and Margaret had taught high school English for 30 years. They were genuinely good people, the kind who sent thoughtful birthday cards and remembered anniversaries, but they had never quite understood what to make of their daughter-in-law's unconventional career path. Rebecca herself was holding court, at the head of the table, wearing a dress that probably cost more than most people spent on groceries in a month. She worked hard for her money, I'd give her that. But she also made sure everyone knew exactly how hard and exactly how much. Her husband Tom sat beside her, nodding along to whatever story she was telling about her latest promotion at the healthcare company where she managed a team of 12 people. Michael's younger brother James arrived shortly after us, still carrying the slight air of academic superiority that came with being 3 years into a PhD program. He was studying environmental engineering, working on something involving water purification systems that would probably save lives someday. The family was incredibly proud of his academic achievements, and rightfully so. James was brilliant, dedicated, and genuinely passionate about making the world better through his research. What struck me most about family gatherings was how effortlessly everyone else's accomplishments were celebrated and understood. When James talked about his research, the table listened with rapt attention. When David shared stories about buildings he'd designed that were still standing decades later, everyone marveled at his lasting impact. When Margaret mentioned former students who still sent her Christmas cards, the conversation turned to the profound influence teachers have on young lives. But when the conversation inevitably turned to me, the energy always shifted. It wasn't malicious exactly, but there was a subtle change in the room's atmosphere, as if everyone was bracing themselves for an awkward moment they'd rather skip over entirely. Rebecca's work friends had joined us for dinner, 3 women from her department who clearly admired her success and shared her worldview about what constituted legitimate professional achievement. They spoke the language of corporate hierarchies, performance metrics, and annual reviews. Within minutes of sitting down, they were deep in conversation about office politics, upcoming budget meetings, and strategic planning sessions that would determine next year's departmental goals. I found myself genuinely interested in their work. Healthcare administration was complex and important, requiring the kind of organizational skills and attention to detail that I deeply respected. But as I listened to their conversation, I realized how foreign my own work would sound to them. How do you explain digital marketing strategy to people who measure success in terms of staff meetings attended and budgets managed? How do you describe the satisfaction of helping a small business owner triple their online revenue to people whose professional validation comes from climbing clearly defined corporate ladders? The appetizers arrived, and with them came the inevitable question I'd been dreading all evening. Margaret, sweet and well-meaning as always, turned to me with that bright smile she reserved for conversations she wasn't quite sure how to navigate. Eliza, dear, how has your work been going lately? Are you keeping busy? The question was innocent enough, but I could feel the table's attention shift toward me. Rebecca's friends looked politely interested, the way people do when they're prepared, to listen to something they don't expect to find particularly engaging. James glanced up from his phone, probably grateful for a break from pretending to care about Rebecca's work stories. Michael reached over and squeezed my hand, a gesture that was meant to be supportive, but somehow felt more like preparation for an ordeal we both had to endure. Things are going well, I replied, keeping my voice even and pleasant. I've been working with some interesting clients lately. There's a lot happening in the digital marketing space right now. Rebecca leaned forward slightly, and I recognized the look in her eyes. It was the same expression a cat gets when it spots a mouse that doesn't yet realize it's being hunted. That's wonderful, she said, her voice dripping with the kind of enthusiasm that sounded genuine but felt hollow. Digital marketing, that's like social media and websites, right? It must be nice to work from home. I imagine you have so much flexibility in your schedule. There it was. The first subtle dig of the evening, wrapped in what sounded like a compliment, but was actually a dismissal. Rebecca had just reduced my complex consulting business to social media and websites, while simultaneously implying that my flexible schedule was evidence of a lack of serious professional commitment. One of Rebecca's colleagues, a woman named Patricia who managed the hospital's patient relations department, picked up the thread. "Oh, I envy people who can work from home. I bet you never have to deal with difficult coworkers or pointless meetings. It must be so peaceful, just working by yourself all day." The implication was clear. Real work involved difficult coworkers and pointless meetings. Real work required suffering through corporate bureaucracy and office politics. My peaceful, flexible work environment was evidence that what I did wasn't quite real enough to be taken seriously. Michael jumped in. Bless him, though his attempt at defense fell flat. "Eliza works really hard," he said, his voice carrying a slight defensive edge that made everyone uncomfortable. "She's always on her computer, taking calls with clients." The silence that followed was painful. Michael's description of my work, always, on my computer, taking calls, made it sound like I was playing at being busy rather than actually accomplishing anything meaningful. His heart was in the right place, but he'd inadvertently reinforced their perception of my work as somehow less substantial than theirs. Rebecca smiled that particular smile she reserved for moments when she felt she'd scored a point. "I'm sure. Eliza works very hard," she said, her tone suggesting the opposite. "It's just so different from traditional work environments. I don't know how I'd stay motivated without colleagues and deadlines and all the structure that comes with a real office setting." The word real hung in the air like smoke from a fire that was just beginning to catch. I felt my chest tighten with familiar frustration, the same feeling I'd experienced hundreds of times over the years, when my professional life was casually dismissed by people who couldn't see past their own limited definitions of success. I took a sip of wine and reminded myself of the decision I'd made months earlier. I would not engage in these battles anymore. I would not defend myself to people who were determined to misunderstand me. I would smile, nod, and redirect the conversation to safer ground. But as I sat there, surrounded by the gentle hum of conversation that had moved on to safer topics, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was building toward a breaking point. The evening was still young, and I could sense the familiar undercurrents of judgment flowing beneath the polite surface of family dinner conversation. I had no idea that within the next hour, everything would change in a way that would shift the entire dynamic of my relationship with this family forever. The main courses had just been served when Rebecca decided to launch her most devastating assault yet. We'd made it through the appetizers with only minor skirmishes, and I'd begun to hope that perhaps this dinner would be different, that maybe the birthday celebration atmosphere would keep things civil. I should have known better. It started innocuously enough. James was telling us about his recent research presentation at a conference in Denver, describing how his work on water purification systems had caught the attention of several environmental organizations. The family listened with genuine pride and interest, asking thoughtful questions about his methodology and potential applications. I found myself genuinely engaged in the conversation, impressed by his passion and expertise. It's so inspiring to see young people making such meaningful contributions to society, Margaret said, beaming at her youngest son. Your father and I are so proud of the work you're doing, James. It feels important, substantial. David nodded in agreement. There's something deeply satisfying about work that has lasting impact, that leaves the world a little better than you found it. Rebecca, who had been unusually quiet during James's presentation, suddenly perked up with renewed energy. I recognized the look in her eyes. It was the same predatory gleam she got whenever she spotted an opportunity to make a point about work, success, and contribution to society. That's exactly what I was thinking, Rebecca said, her voice taking on that particular tone she used when she was building toward something. There's such a difference between work that actually matters and work that's just, well, busy work. The conversation could have gone in any direction from there, but I felt a familiar chill run down my spine. Michael must have sensed it too, because I felt his hand tighten slightly around his wine glass. I mean, Rebecca continued, warming to her theme, some people spend their whole lives in meaningful careers, teaching, healthcare, research, engineering, making real contributions to their communities and society. And then there are people who just float along, pretending to be busy with little hobbies and calling it work. The table had gone quiet. Even Rebecca's work friends seemed to sense that the conversation was veering into uncomfortable territory. Patricia looked down at her plate, suddenly very interested in her salmon. James frowned slightly, clearly unsure where his sister was going with this. But Rebecca wasn't finished. If anything, the attention seemed to fuel her confidence. Take Eliza, for example, she said, turning to face me directly with a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. 7 years married to my brother, and what does she have to show for it? No real job, no career advancement, no contribution to society, or even to her own household. The words hit me like a physical blow. I felt the blood drain from my face, as every person at that table turned to look at me. The humiliation was instant and overwhelming, not just because of what Rebecca had said, but because of where she had chosen to say it. In front of Michael's parents, his brother, her colleagues, in a public setting where I had no escape and no real way to defend myself without causing an even bigger scene. Rebecca, Michael said, his voice carrying a warning tone. But she was just getting started. No, seriously, she continued, her voice rising slightly with the enthusiasm of someone who believed she was finally speaking truth to power. I work 45 hours a week managing a team of 12 people in a critical healthcare setting. James is pursuing groundbreaking research that could save lives. Mom spent 30 years shaping young minds. Dad designed buildings that house families and businesses. She paused for dramatic effect, letting her words sink in before delivering the killing blow. And Eliza sits at home all day, calling herself an entrepreneur while contributing absolutely nothing to society, to this family, or apparently even to her own marriage. Michael works his ass off to support both of them while she plays around on her laptop and calls it a business. The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, feel the heat rising in my cheeks as every person at that table processed what had just happened. Rebecca had just publicly called me jobless, useless, and a financial burden on her brother in front of his entire family and her professional colleagues. Margaret looked horrified, her face flushed with embarrassment at her daughter's behavior. David was staring at his plate, clearly uncomfortable with the turn the evening had taken. James looked genuinely confused, as if he couldn't quite believe his sister had just said what she'd said. Rebecca's work friends were studying their wine, glasses with the kind of intense focus people reserve for moments when they desperately wish they were anywhere else. But it was Michael's reaction that hurt the most. Instead of immediately defending me, instead of shutting down his sister's attack, he looked conflicted. There was a moment, just a flash, where I saw doubt in his eyes, as if he was wondering whether Rebecca might have a point. The internal battle that raged within me in those few seconds felt like it lasted hours. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to fight back, to defend myself, to explain exactly how wrong Rebecca was about everything she'd just said. I wanted to tell them about the 6-figure contracts I'd secured, the businesses I'd helped save from bankruptcy, the innovative marketing strategies I'd developed that had been featured in industry publications. I wanted to explain that my laptop, playing, involved complex data analysis, strategic planning, and creative problem-solving that required skills Rebecca couldn't even comprehend. I wanted to detail every client success story, every revenue increase I'd generated, every business relationship I'd built through careful cultivation and professional expertise. But more than anything, I wanted to tell them that I had been carrying more than my share of household expenses for the past 3 years, that Michael wasn't supporting me financially. If anything, my income had been supporting some of his career transitions and professional development opportunities. The words were right there, ready to pour out in a torrent of facts and figures that would have completely demolished Rebecca's attack and left her speechless. I could have humiliated her the way she had just humiliated me, could have turned the tables so completely that she would never dare question my professional worth again. But I didn't. In that moment of crisis, I made a choice that surprised even me. I chose dignity over defense, silence over spectacle. Years of meditation and therapy had taught me that other people's opinions of me were not my responsibility to manage, and engaging in a public battle with Rebecca would diminish us both. Instead, I took a slow sip of my wine, looked directly at Rebecca with what I hoped was calm composure, and said simply, "I'm sorry you feel that way." The response clearly wasn't what she had expected. She had been prepared for me to either crumble under her attack or lash out defensively, giving her more ammunition for her assault. My quiet dignity seemed to deflate her momentum slightly, but she wasn't ready to let it go. "That's it?" she pressed. "That's your response? Don't you think Michael deserves better than someone who can't even hold down a real job?" This time Michael did speak up. "Rebecca, that's enough. You're out of line." But the damage was already done. The words hung in the air between us like poison, and I could feel something fundamental shifting in my relationship with this family. The careful balance I had maintained for 7 years, the polite tolerance, the strategic silence, the gracious acceptance of their judgment, had finally reached its breaking point. I was still processing the full impact of what had just happened when my phone started ringing. The sound of my phone buzzing against the table cut through the tension like a knife. Under normal circumstances, I would have immediately declined the call. Answering your phone during a family dinner was the kind of social breach that would have given Rebecca even more ammunition for her attacks on my character and professionalism. But these weren't normal circumstances, and frankly, I welcomed any interruption that might break the suffocating atmosphere that had settled over our table. I glanced at the screen and saw Maya's name displayed. Maya was my assistant, a brilliant, recent MBA graduate who helped me manage the operational side of my consulting business. She was meticulous, professional, and knew better than to call me during personal time unless something truly urgent had come up. The fact that she was calling at 8:30 on a Saturday evening meant this was important. "I'm sorry," I said to the table, my voice steadier than I felt. "I need to take this. It's work-related." Rebecca let out a small, derisive laugh. "Work-related?" she said, her voice dripping with skepticism. "On a Saturday night? What kind of work emergency could you possibly have?" I ignored her commentary and answered the call. "Hi, Maya. What's going on?" "Eliza, I'm so sorry to bother you during your family dinner." Maya's voice came through clearly. I had forgotten that my phone was set to speaker mode from earlier when I'd been listening to a podcast in the car. But I have Robert Chen from Pacific Northwest Innovations on the other line, and he's insisting on speaking with you tonight about the campaign results. The name Robert Chen meant nothing to the people at my table, but it meant everything to me. Pacific Northwest Innovations was one of my largest clients, a tech startup that I'd been working with for the past 8 months to completely overhaul their digital marketing strategy. Robert was their CEO, and the campaign Maya was referring to was a comprehensive product launch that had gone live 3 weeks ago. What's the urgency? I asked, suddenly concerned that something had gone wrong with the campaign. The opposite, actually, Maya said, and I could hear the excitement in her voice even through the phone's speaker. The preliminary numbers are in, and they're incredible. The campaign has exceeded all projected metrics by over 300%. Robert wants to discuss immediate expansion of our contract and is talking about bringing us on as their exclusive digital marketing partner. I felt my heart skip a beat. This was the kind of success story that could transform my business, the validation of everything I'd been working toward for the past several years. But as I looked around the table at the faces staring at me in confusion, I realized that this phone call was about to reveal truths that I had been carefully keeping private. Can you give me the specific numbers? I asked, knowing that Maya would understand I needed the full picture. Absolutely. The social media engagement increased by 340%. Website traffic is up 275%. And most importantly, actual conversions, people purchasing their products, increased by 289%. Based on their average order value, this campaign has already generated over $1.2 million in direct revenue for them in just 3 weeks. The silence at our dinner table was profound. I could see the confusion on everyone's faces as they tried to process what they were hearing. Numbers like that didn't come from someone playing around on their laptop as a hobby. Those were the kind of results that came from sophisticated marketing strategies, deep industry knowledge, and the kind of professional expertise that commanded serious respect and compensation. That's incredible, I said, genuinely pleased but also acutely aware of my audience. What's Robert's timeline for the expansion discussion? He wants to set up a call for Monday morning to discuss increasing our monthly retainer from $15,000 to $35,000, plus performance bonuses. He's also interested in having us take over their entire digital presence, website redesign, content strategy, social media management, everything. I heard someone at the table make a small choking sound. I wasn't sure who, but I could feel the energy in the room shifting dramatically. Rebecca's work friends were looking at each other with raised eyebrows, and even James had put down his phone to listen more carefully to my conversation. That sounds like a conversation we should definitely have, I said, trying to keep my voice professional, despite the surreal nature of conducting business in front of people who had just finished questioning my professional credibility. Can you schedule something for Monday at 10? And Maya, can you send me the full analytics report tonight so I can review everything before we talk to Robert? Already in your inbox, Maya replied efficiently. Oh, and Eliza, congratulations. This is a huge win for the company. You should be really proud of what you've built. The word company hung in the air like a revelation. Not hobby, not little business, not laptop playing, company. Maya was referring to my work with the kind of professional respect that comes from being inside an organization and seeing how it actually operates. Thank you, Maya. I appreciate everything you do to make these successes possible. I'll talk to you Monday. I ended the call and looked up to find every person at the table staring at me, with expressions ranging from confusion to shock to what might have been the beginning of understanding. The contrast between the conversation they had just overheard and Rebecca's characterization of my work was so stark that it was impossible to ignore. Rebecca was the first to speak, though her voice had lost much of its earlier confidence. Who was that? What was that about? For the first time all team evening, I felt like I had some control over the conversation. Not because I was planning to gloat or attack, but because the truth was finally beginning to speak for itself in a way that required no defense or explanation from me. That was my assistant, I said simply. We've been working on a digital marketing campaign for a tech company, and apparently it's been more successful than we projected. Michael was staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Your assistant? He said slowly. Eliza, you never mentioned you had an assistant. You never asked, I replied, which was true. In all the years we'd been married, Michael had never shown genuine curiosity about the operational details of my business. He knew I worked with clients, but he'd never inquired about my team, my processes, or the scope of what I was actually managing. David cleared his throat carefully. Eliza, forgive me, but that sounded like quite a substantial project. The numbers your assistant mentioned. He trailed off, clearly unsure how to ask the question he wanted to ask without revealing how little they actually knew about my professional life. Margaret looked genuinely embarrassed. Dear, I think we may have, that is, perhaps we haven't been asking the right questions about your work. Rebecca's colleagues were whispering quietly to each other, and I caught fragments of their conversation. Words like impressive and had no idea floated across the table. Patricia, the patient relations manager, was looking at me with what appeared to be newfound respect. But it was Rebecca's reaction that surprised me the most. Instead of the defensive anger I had expected, she looked genuinely confused, as if she was trying to reconcile the phone conversation she'd just heard with the narrative she'd constructed about my life. I don't understand, she said finally. If you're running some kind of successful business, why didn't you ever tell us? Why let us think? She didn't finish the sentence, but we all knew what she meant. Why let us think you were unemployed? Why let us think you were a burden? Why let us think you were contributing nothing to your marriage or to society? The questions hung in the air, and I realized that the phone call from Maya had cracked open a door that had been sealed shut for 7 years. The truth about my professional life was beginning to spill out, and there was no way to put it back, the thought. Silence that followed Rebecca's unfinished question stretched on for what felt like an eternity. I could see the wheels turning in everyone's minds as they tried to reconcile the conversation they'd just overheard with everything they thought they knew about my life. The numbers Maya had mentioned, $1.2 million in revenue, monthly retainers of $35,000, performance bonuses, these weren't the kind of figures associated with someone playing around on their laptop as a hobby. Michael was the first to break the silence. And when he spoke, his voice carried a mixture of confusion and something that might have been hurt. Eliza, I think I'm missing something here. Can you help me understand what exactly your business involves? It was such a simple question, but it highlighted everything that had gone wrong in our communication over the years. My own husband was asking me to explain my work as if he was learning about it for the first time, which, in many ways, he was. I had been so worn down by the family's dismissive attitude that I had stopped sharing the details of my successes, my challenges, my growth. I had retreated into professional isolation, keeping my achievements private to avoid the exhausting cycle of minimization and doubt. I run a digital marketing consulting firm, I said, my voice steady despite the emotional turmoil I was feeling. I specialize in helping small to medium-sized businesses develop and implement comprehensive digital marketing strategies. That includes everything from social media management and content creation to website optimization, email marketing campaigns, and data analytics. James leaned forward, suddenly interested. Wait, you're talking about real strategic consulting? Like analyzing market data and developing customized approaches for different business models? Exactly, I replied, grateful for his genuine curiosity. Each client requires a completely different approach based on their industry, target demographic, competitive landscape, and business goals. The project Maya was calling about involved developing a full product launch strategy for a tech startup, market research, competitor analysis, content creation, advertising campaigns across multiple platforms, and ongoing performance optimization. David, who had spent his career in architecture, was nodding slowly as if pieces of a puzzle were finally clicking into place. That sounds incredibly complex. How many clients do you typically work with at once? Right now, I have 12 active clients, I said. Some are on monthly retainer contracts for ongoing services. Others are project-based engagements that can last anywhere from 3 months to over a year. Maya helps me manage the operational side: scheduling, client communications, project tracking, and preliminary data analysis. Margaret's face had gone pale. Eliza, dear, when you say monthly retainers, are we talking about significant amounts? Hesitated for a moment, knowing that once I answered this question, there would be no going back to the comfortable fiction that I was financially dependent on Michael. It varies depending on the client and scope of services. The smallest retainer is $8,000 a month. The largest is currently $35,000. Project fees can range from $15,000 to over $100,000, depending on complexity and timeline. The sharp intake of breath from Rebecca was audible across the table. Her work friends were staring at me with expressions of shock and what appeared to be newfound respect. Patricia, who managed a hospital department with an annual budget in the millions, looked as if she was recalculating everything she thought she knew about my professional capabilities. That's substantial income, David said carefully. Eliza, forgive me for asking, but how long have you been operating at this level? The business has been growing steadily for the past 5 years, I replied. The first 2 years were building the foundation, developing systems, establishing credibility, creating case studies. But for the past 3 years, my annual revenue has been consistently higher than Michael's salary. Michael's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, confusion, and then what looked like embarrassment. Higher than my salary? He repeated quietly. I nodded, feeling a mixture of vindication and sadness that it had come to this. Significantly higher. I've been covering the majority of our household expenses, our savings contributions, and the down payment for the house. Renovation we did last year came entirely from my business income. The revelation hit the table like a bomb. Rebecca's mouth was literally hanging open, her earlier confidence completely shattered. The woman who had spent the last 20 minutes calling me jobless and questioning my contribution to my own marriage was now confronting the reality that I had been the primary breadwinner in our household for years. But why? Rebecca started, then stopped, clearly struggling to formulate a question that wouldn't reveal how completely wrong she had been about everything. Why didn't I tell you? I finished for her. Because every time I tried to talk about my work, it was dismissed, minimized, or treated as a temporary phase I would eventually grow out of. When I mentioned client meetings, they were assumed to be casual coffee dates. When I talked about project deadlines, they were seen as self-imposed busy work rather than actual professional commitments. When I tried to explain the complexity of what I do, I was met with blank stares or suggestions that I should get a real job with benefits and security. James was shaking his head slowly. Eliza, I had no idea. The way you just described your work, that's sophisticated business. Strategy, that requires serious expertise and knowledge. It does, I agreed. I have certifications in digital marketing, analytics, and business strategy. I attend industry conferences, maintain relationships with other consultants and marketing professionals, and spend considerable time staying current with constantly evolving technology and platforms. This isn't something I stumbled into or picked up as a hobby. It's a legitimate professional practice that I've built through years of dedicated work and continuous learning. Margaret looked genuinely distressed. Eliza, I feel terrible. We haven't understood what you do at all, have we? No, I said simply, without anger or accusation. You haven't. And I stopped trying to help you understand because it was emotionally exhausting to constantly defend the legitimacy of my career to people who had already decided it wasn't real. Rebecca's colleagues were whispering among themselves, and I caught enough of their conversation to understand that they were discussing the implications of what they'd just learned. These were healthcare professionals who understood budgets, strategic planning, and the complexity of managing multiple projects simultaneously. They were recognizing that what I had described wasn't just a job. It was a sophisticated business operation that required exactly the kinds of skills they used in their own professional roles. "Eliza," Patricia said suddenly. "The client your assistant mentioned, the one with the 1.2 million in revenue results, how long did that project take to develop and implement?" 8 months from initial consultation to launch, I replied. That included market research, competitor analysis, brand positioning, content strategy development, website optimization, social media campaign creation, and advertising campaign design and management. Patricia nodded slowly. That's a comprehensive, strategic initiative. In healthcare, a project of that scope would involve multiple departments and dozens of professionals. I had a team, I said. Maya manages a lot of the operational details. I work with freelance graphic designers for visual content, copywriters for specialized content creation, and web developers for technical implementation. I'm not doing everything myself. I'm managing and coordinating a collaborative effort, much like a project manager in any other industry. The picture that was emerging was so different from the narrative Rebecca had constructed that she seemed to be struggling to process it. The woman she had just publicly humiliated for being jobless and contributing nothing to society was actually running a business that generated more revenue than most of their combined salaries. Michael was staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Eliza, why didn't you tell me about the income levels? About how much you've been contributing financially?" It was a fair question, but the answer was complicated. "Because you never asked," I said gently. "When I tried to share my successes, they were met with polite disinterest or subtle skepticism. When your family questioned my work, you didn't defend me or seek to understand more about what I do. Over time, I learned that sharing my professional achievements created more stress than satisfaction, so I stopped." The weight of what I was saying seemed to settle over the table like a heavy blanket. These people had spent years making assumptions about my life, my work, my value, and my contribution to my marriage and society. And every single assumption had been wrong. Rebecca finally found her voice, though it was much quieter than it had been earlier in the evening. "Eliza, I don't know what to say. I had no idea that you were running such a successful business." I looked at her for a long moment before responding. "Rebecca, you never asked. None of you ever asked. You saw that I worked from home and assumed that meant I didn't really work. You saw flexible schedules and assumed that meant I wasn't serious about my career. You made judgments based on your limited understanding of what professional success looks like, and you never bothered to dig deeper." The truth was finally out. But as I sat there looking at the shocked faces around the table, I felt more sadness than satisfaction. This revelation shouldn't have been necessary. These relationships shouldn't have been built on such fundamental misunderstandings. And the fact that it had taken a public humiliation and an accidental phone call to reveal the truth said something profound about how we had all failed to really see and understand each other. The silence that followed my explanation was different from the earlier tension-filled pauses. This wasn't the quiet of people waiting for the next verbal blow to land. It was the heavy silence of people grappling with the complete collapse of their understanding of reality. I could almost see the mental gymnastics happening around the table as each person tried to reconcile years of assumptions with the truth that had just been laid bare. Rebecca was the first to recover, but not in the way I had expected. Instead of the apology or acknowledgement I might have hoped for, her embarrassment quickly transformed into something uglier, defensive anger. Her face had flushed red, and when she spoke, her voice carried the sharp edge of someone who felt cornered and exposed. "Well, if you're so successful, if your business is so impressive, why keep it a secret?" she demanded, her tone accusatory despite the fact that she was the one who had been proven wrong. What kind of person hides their success from their own? Family? It's manipulative, Eliza. You let us all think. You made us look like fools. The audacity of her response took my breath away. Even faced with undeniable evidence that she had been completely wrong about my professional life, Rebecca was finding a way to make me the villain in this story. She had spent years publicly questioning my worth, my contribution, my legitimacy. And now that she'd been proven wrong, her response was to blame me for not correcting her forcefully enough. "I didn't make you look like anything," I replied, my voice steady despite the anger rising in my chest. "You made assumptions without bothering to ask questions. You decided what my work was worth without ever trying to understand what it actually involved. I stopped sharing because every time I tried, my accomplishments were minimized or dismissed." Rebecca's colleague Patricia shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She had witnessed the entire evening unfold, had heard Rebecca's attack, and now was seeing Rebecca's refusal to take responsibility for her behavior. "Rebecca," she said quietly, "maybe we should—" "No," Rebecca interrupted, her voice rising. "This is exactly what I'm talking about. Eliza could have corrected us at any time. She could have shown us client testimonials, or revenue reports, or whatever proof she needed to demonstrate that her business was legitimate. Instead, she chose to sit there in martyred silence, letting us make assumptions. And now she gets to play the victim while we all look like villains." The manipulation in Rebecca's logic was stunning. She was rewriting history in real time, casting herself as the victim of some elaborate deception rather than acknowledging that she had been the aggressor in a years-long campaign of professional undermining. She was making my choice to maintain privacy about my income and success into evidence of manipulation rather than examining her own assumptions and behavior. Michael was caught in the middle, and I could see the conflict playing out on his face. His loyalty to his family was warring with the growing realization that his wife had been treated unfairly for years, and that he had been complicit in that treatment. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful, measured, as if he was trying to navigate between two minefields. "Eliza, I think what Rebecca is trying to say is that maybe if we had known more about your business, about how successful you were, things might have been different between all of us." His words stung because they revealed how conditional his family's respect had always been. The implication was that my worth as a person was tied to my income level, that I deserved better treatment only if I could prove financial success. The fact that I was a kind, intelligent, caring person who contributed to our relationship and community in countless ways apparently wasn't enough to earn basic respect. I needed to have a high enough income to qualify for dignity. "Michael," I said quietly, "do you hear what you're saying? You're suggesting that I deserve the treatment I receive because I didn't adequately prove my financial worth to your family. Is that really the standard you want to set for respect and kindness?" David, who had been uncharacteristically quiet since my revelation, cleared his throat. "I think what Michael means," he said carefully, "is that we all made assumptions, and perhaps if we had better communication, we could have avoided this situation entirely." It was a diplomatic response, and I appreciated that he was trying to diffuse the tension, but it still missed the fundamental point. The problem wasn't lack of communication, it was lack of respect. I had tried to communicate about my work for years, but my explanations had been met with skepticism, dismissal, and condescension. The issue wasn't that they didn't have enough information, it was that they had decided my information wasn't credible. Margaret looked genuinely distressed, and when she spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. "Eliza, I feel terrible about this. I never meant to make you feel unwelcome or unvalued. I thought I was being supportive, but I realize now that I didn't really understand what kind of support you needed." Her response was the first one that felt genuine and thoughtful, acknowledging both her mistakes and her good intentions without trying to shift blame or minimize the impact of her behavior. I felt a wave of affection for her, recognizing that she was probably the one person at this table who was willing to genuinely examine her own role in this situation. "I know you meant well," I told her sincerely, "but good intentions don't erase the impact of assumptions. When people constantly question the legitimacy of your work, when they treat your professional achievements as hobbies or phases, it's emotionally exhausting regardless of their intentions." James, who had been listening intently to the entire exchange, shook his head in apparent frustration. "This is insane," he said bluntly. "Eliza, you're describing work that's more complex and financially successful than what most of us do, and we've been treating you like you were unemployed. How did we get this so wrong?" His question cut to the heart of something I had been thinking about for years. How do successful people become invisible? How does achievement become questioned? When it doesn't fit conventional formats? The answer, I had learned, was through a combination of assumptions, biases, and the human tendency to understand new information only through the lens of familiar experiences. "You got it wrong," I said, "because you defined work and success very narrowly. You assumed that legitimate work happens in offices, with colleagues, with traditional structures and hierarchies. You couldn't see past the surface of what I was doing to understand the substance underneath. And once you had made up your minds about what my work was worth, you stopped being curious about whether you might be wrong." Rebecca was still seething, clearly unhappy with the direction the conversation had taken. "So now we're all terrible people because we didn't recognize your hidden genius, because we couldn't see through your mysterious act to the successful business owner underneath?" Her sarcasm was ugly and defensive, but it also revealed something important about her character. Even faced with clear evidence that she had been wrong, even surrounded by family members who were beginning to acknowledge their mistakes and express regret, Rebecca was doubling down on her position. She was more committed to being right than to being fair, more interested in protecting her ego than in repairing relationships. "Rebecca," I said, my voice calm but firm. "I never claimed to be a genius, and there was nothing mysterious about what I was doing. I worked from home. I took client calls. I met deadlines. I attended virtual conferences. None of that was hidden. You just decided it wasn't important enough to pay attention to. The truth was that I had chosen privacy over recognition for very specific reasons, and those reasons were being demonstrated in real time at this dinner table. I had learned from experience that sharing professional successes with people who were determined to minimize them was more harmful than helpful. I had protected my emotional well-being by keeping my achievements private, sharing them only with people who could appreciate and celebrate them appropriately. But privacy, I was learning, comes with its own costs. When you don't advocate for yourself, when you don't insist on recognition and respect, some people will assume there's nothing worth recognizing or respecting. My choice to maintain dignity through silence had been interpreted as evidence that there was nothing worth defending. The irony wasn't lost on me that Rebecca was now angry about the very privacy that her years of dismissive behavior had created. She had trained me not to share my successes with this family, and now she was using my learned silence as evidence of manipulation and deception. As I looked around the table at the faces of people I had tried so hard to belong with, I realized that this dinner had revealed something fundamental about all of us. It had shown who we really were when faced with uncomfortable truths about ourselves, and not everyone was handling that revelation with grace. The question now was where we would go from here. As the tension around the table continued to simmer, I realized that there was a deeper layer to this story that needed to be told. Rebecca's accusation that I had been manipulative by keeping my success private had touched a nerve, not because it was true, but because it completely misunderstood the reasons behind my choices. The decision to maintain privacy about my business hadn't been made lightly or strategically. It had been born out of painful experience and hard-learned wisdom about self-protection. "You want to know why I kept my business private?" I said, my voice cutting through the murmur of side conversations that had started around the table. "It's not because I was trying to manipulate anyone or play victim. It's because I learned a long time ago that sharing achievements with the wrong people can be more damaging than keeping them to yourself." Michael looked at me with surprise. "What do you mean by that?" I took a deep breath, knowing that what I was about to share would reveal vulnerabilities I had kept carefully guarded for years. Before I met Michael, I was in a relationship with someone whose family had very strong opinions about women and careers. When I got my first promotion at the marketing firm where I worked, I was so excited that I shared the news at a family dinner, much like this one. The table had gone quiet again, but this time the attention felt different. Less voyeuristic, more genuinely curious about understanding something they had clearly missed. His mother's response was to ask whether the promotion meant I would be working longer hours and whether that was fair to her son. His sister suggested that career-focused women often struggle to maintain healthy relationships. His father made a joke about how companies promote women to fill quotas rather than based on merit. By the end of that dinner, my professional achievement had been completely diminished and turned into evidence of character flaws and relationship problems. I could see understanding beginning to dawn on some faces around the table. Margaret looked particularly stricken, perhaps recognizing some parallels to conversations that had happened at their own family gatherings over the years. That relationship didn't last, I continued. But the lesson stayed with me. I learned that sharing good news with people who aren't genuinely happy for your success is like giving them ammunition to use against you later. When someone has already decided that your achievements threaten their worldview or make them uncomfortable, providing more details about those achievements doesn't change their mind. It just gives them more specific things to criticize. James was nodding slowly. So when you started your business, you were already predisposed to keep it private because of past experiences? Partly, I acknowledged, but also because the early responses from this family confirmed that the same dynamic was going to play out here. The first time I mentioned leaving my corporate job to start consulting, the questions weren't, "How can we support you?" or "What's your vision for the business?" They were, "Are you sure that's wise?" and "What if it doesn't work out?" and "Shouldn't. You have a backup plan?" Rebecca opened her mouth to respond, but I held up a hand, not finished with my explanation. "I'm not saying those weren't reasonable questions," I said. They were, but they were the only questions. There was no curiosity about my business plan, no interest in my market research, no enthusiasm for my vision. The focus was entirely on the risks and potential failures, which sent a clear message about how my entrepreneurial efforts would be received in this family. David looked uncomfortable. "Eliza, I think we were trying to be realistic. Starting a business is risky, and we cared about your financial security." "I understand that," I replied. "But there's a difference between expressing concern and expressing faith. You expressed concern about my ability to succeed, but you never expressed faith in my ability to overcome challenges. You focused on what could go wrong rather than what could go right. That kind of energy is toxic when you're trying to build something new." The insight seemed to resonate with several people at the table. Building a business, like any creative endeavor, requires a certain amount of optimism and confidence. When the people closest to you consistently focus on the potential for failure, it becomes emotionally exhausting to maintain the positive mindset necessary for success. But beyond that, I continued, I learned something important about myself. Over the years, I discovered that I work better without an audience of critics. When I stopped trying to prove my worth to people who had already decided I was worth less, my business actually improved. I could focus my energy on serving clients and building relationships with people who valued what I brought to the table. This was perhaps the most important truth I could share. The realization that not everyone deserves access to your dreams and achievements. Some people are energy givers, and some are energy drains. Learning to identify the difference and protect yourself accordingly isn't manipulation. It's emotional intelligence. Margaret wiped her eyes with her napkin. "Eliza, I never realized that our questions felt like criticism to you. I thought we were being supportive by helping you think through potential challenges. I know you meant, well," I said gently, "but impact matters more than intention. When someone is building something new, they need cheerleaders more than they need critics. They need people who see possibilities more than people who see problems. I already had plenty of my own doubts and fears. I didn't need more from my family." Michael was staring at his hands, and when he looked up, his expression was pained. "Eliza, I feel like I failed you. I should have been your biggest cheerleader. And instead, I let my family's concerns influence how I talk to you about your business. His acknowledgement meant more to me than I could express. For years, I had felt like I was fighting for validation on two fronts, trying to prove myself professionally while also trying to maintain peace in my marriage. Having Michael recognize his role in that dynamic was the first step toward healing some deep wounds. The exhaustion of constantly proving yourself is real, I said, addressing the whole table. When you have to justify your choices, your methods, your success, your timeline, your priorities over and over again, it drains the joy out of achievement. I stopped sharing because I wanted to protect the joy I found in my work. Patricia, who had been quietly observing the entire conversation, finally spoke up. Eliza, I have to say, listening to you tonight has been eye-opening. In my work in healthcare, I see this dynamic play out with patients all the time. People whose symptoms are dismissed or minimized because they don't fit expected patterns. The impact on their willingness to seek help in the future is profound. Her analogy was apt. When your experiences are consistently invalidated, you learn to stop sharing them. When your achievements are consistently minimized, you learn to stop celebrating them publicly. It's a form of learned helplessness that can extend far beyond the original relationships that created it. I found peace in working without an audience, I explained. My clients appreciated my work, my results spoke for themselves, and I didn't have to waste mental energy defending my choices to people who weren't invested in my success. That peace allowed me to focus entirely on excellence rather than on external validation. The irony, of course, was that this focus on excellence had led to the very success that was now shocking my family. By removing the pressure to prove myself to them, I had freed myself to actually succeed beyond anything they could have imagined. Rebecca had been unusually quiet during this explanation, and when she finally spoke, her voice was subdued. So, you're saying that our questions and concerns actually held you back? No, I replied carefully. I'm saying that your questions and concerns required emotional energy that I needed for other things. I made a choice to redirect that energy toward my work and my clients, and that choice contributed to my success. But it also created distance in our relationship, and I accept responsibility for that part of the dynamic. It was important to acknowledge that my choices had consequences too. Privacy and protection come with costs, and one of those costs had been the very misunderstanding we were now trying to navigate. The deeper truth, I said, looking around the table at each person, is that I learned to value my own opinion of my work more than anyone else's. That's not selfishness. That's emotional maturity. And it's a lesson I wouldn't trade, even for better family relationships. The weight of that statement settled over the dinner table like a final punctuation mark on 7 years of misunderstanding. The drive home from the restaurant was quiet, in a way that felt heavy with unspoken thoughts and emotions. Michael's hands gripped the steering wheel a little too tightly, and I could see the tension in his jaw as he processed everything that had happened over the course of the evening. I stared out the passenger window at the familiar streets of our neighborhood, feeling emotionally drained, but also strangely relieved that the truth was finally out in the open. Neither of us spoke until we were inside our house, the front door, closed behind us like a barrier between the outside world and the conversation we both knew we needed to have. Michael went straight to the kitchen and poured himself a glass of wine, then looked at me questioningly. I nodded, and he poured a second glass, handing it to me with the kind of careful attention people give to potentially explosive situations. "We need to talk," he said finally, his voice carrying a weariness that matched my own. "Yes, we do," I agreed, settling onto the couch in our living room. The same living room where I had conducted dozens of client video calls, where I had built strategies that generated millions in revenue for businesses across the country, where I had created the success that his family had spent years denying existed. Michael sat down beside me, but not close enough to touch, and the physical distance felt symbolic of the emotional distance that had been growing between us for months. He took a long sip of his wine before speaking. "Eliza, I owe you an apology." he began, his voice quiet, but steady. Not just for tonight, but for years of, I don't even know what to call it. Neglect? Blindness? I failed you as a husband, and I'm just now understanding how badly. The acknowledgement was something I had been waiting to hear for a long time, but now that it was happening, I felt more sadness than relief. Michael, what hurts the most isn't that you didn't understand my business. It's that you didn't defend me when your family attacked my character. You let them question my worth, my contribution, my value as a person, and you stood by and watched it happen. He flinched as if I had slapped him, and I could see the truth of my words hitting him in real time. You're right, he said after a long pause. I told myself I was staying neutral, keeping the peace, but what I was really doing was choosing their comfort over your dignity. That phrase, choosing their comfort over your dignity, captured something essential about what had been happening in our marriage. Michael had been so concerned with avoiding conflict with his family that he had allowed them to treat me poorly rather than risk the discomfort of standing up to them. When Rebecca called me jobless tonight, I continued, when she questioned what I contribute to our marriage, when she essentially called me a burden and a disappointment, you didn't immediately shut that down. You let her finish her attack before you said anything, and even then, your response was weak. That's enough. Isn't the same as that's completely wrong, and I won't allow you to speak about my wife that way. Michael's face was pale, and I could see him replaying the evening's events in his mind. I was shocked, he said weakly. I didn't know how to respond to something so vicious. But that's exactly when I needed you to respond, I replied. That's when your wife needed her husband to stand up and say, I know who my wife is. I know what she contributes to our life together, and I won't sit here and listen to you tear her down based on your ignorance and assumptions. The conversation was painful, but necessary. For too long, I had been carrying the burden of his family's judgment alone, while Michael remained in the comfortable position of trying to please everyone. But marriage, I was realizing, sometimes requires choosing sides, and he had consistently chosen his family's approval over my emotional well-being. I think, Michael said slowly. I was afraid that if I defended you too strongly, it would make things worse between you and them. I thought if I kept things calm, eventually they would come around and see what I see in you. His reasoning revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of the situation. Michael, they weren't going to come around on their own. They had made up their minds about who I was based on limited information and biased assumptions. The only way that was going to change was if someone they respected, like you, corrected their misconceptions. But you never did. I took a sip of my wine and continued. Instead, your silence became complicity. When you didn't defend me, you were essentially agreeing with them. When you didn't correct their assumptions about my work, you were validating their right to make those assumptions. When you minimized their comments by saying, "That's just how Rebecca is," you were telling me that I should accept disrespectful treatment because it was easier than addressing it. Michael set down his wine glass and put his head in his hands. God, Eliza, I've been such a coward. I've been protecting myself from family conflict at your expense. His self-awareness was important, but I needed him to understand the deeper implications of his choices. It's not just about protecting yourself from conflict, I said. It's about what your priorities were. You prioritized your family's opinion of you over my sense of security in our marriage. You prioritized avoiding awkward conversations over protecting my dignity. You prioritized keeping things smooth over standing up for what was right. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of years of accumulated hurt and disappointment. I had been feeling increasingly alone in our marriage, not because Michael didn't love me, but because he didn't seem willing to fight for me when it mattered most. How do we fix this? He asked finally, looking up at me with eyes that were red, with unshed tears. It was a good question, and one that I had been thinking about for months. We start by acknowledging that this isn't just about your family's behavior, it's about yours. You can't control how they treat me, but you can control how you respond to that treatment. Going forward, I need to know that you're on my side, even when that makes things uncomfortable with your family. Michael nodded slowly. I understand. And I want you to know that seeing you tonight, hearing you explain your work and your success, I felt so proud and so ashamed at the same time. Proud of what you've accomplished, and ashamed that I didn't know enough about it to be proud before tonight. His words touched something deep in my heart, but they also highlighted another issue we needed to address. Michael, the fact that you didn't know about my success isn't entirely your family's fault. I stopped sharing with you too, because I got tired of having my achievements minimized or questioned. We both retreated into our separate worlds instead of fighting for better communication. This was my own contribution to our marital problems, and it was important to acknowledge it. I had protected myself by withdrawing, but that withdrawal had also created distance between us that went beyond his family's influence. I want to know, Michael said earnestly. I want to understand your work, your goals, your challenges. I want to be the husband who celebrates your successes and supports you through difficulties. I want to be worthy of the amazing woman I married. The conversation continued late into the night, covering years of misunderstandings, hurt feelings, and missed opportunities for connection. But for the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful about our marriage. Michael was finally seeing the full picture of what had been happening, and more importantly, he was taking responsibility for his role in it. Real change, I knew, would take time and consistent effort. But the willingness to have this difficult conversation was a crucial first step toward building the kind of partnership I had always wanted us to have. 6 months have passed since that life-changing dinner, and I can honestly say that what felt like the worst evening of my marriage turned out to be one of the most transformative. Sometimes the most painful moments in our lives are also the most necessary, forcing us to confront truths we've been avoiding and make changes we've been postponing. The immediate aftermath wasn't easy. Rebecca sent a text message 3 days later that was half apology, half justification, explaining that she had been caught off guard by my revelations and that she never meant to hurt my feelings. It was the kind of non-apology that takes responsibility for my reaction rather than her actions, and I chose not to respond. Some people aren't ready for the kind of self-reflection that real growth requires, and I had learned to accept that limitation in others without taking it personally. Michael's parents, however, surprised me with their response. Margaret called the next week and asked if she could take me to lunch, just the two of us. During that lunch, she offered a genuine apology that acknowledged the impact of their assumptions and expressed sincere regret for making me feel unwelcome in their family. She asked thoughtful questions about my business, listened with genuine interest to my answers, and by the end of our conversation, I felt like she was seeing me clearly for the first time. David followed up with his own gesture, inviting me to a professional networking event, where he introduced me to several potential clients with obvious pride in my accomplishments. It was a small thing, but it represented a fundamental shift in how he viewed my work and my place in their family. James, perhaps because of his academic background, seemed to understand most quickly how his family had misjudged the situation. He started sending me articles about entrepreneurship and digital marketing trends, engaging with my work in a way that felt both supportive and genuinely curious. Our relationship, which had always been cordial but distant, developed into something closer to real friendship. But the most significant change was in my marriage with Michael. True to his word, from that difficult conversation in our living room, he began making concrete efforts to understand and support my professional life. He started asking specific questions about my projects, celebrating client wins with me, and most importantly, he stopped minimizing my work when talking to others. The real test came 2 months later at his cousin's wedding, where Rebecca made another comment about how nice it must be to work from home in pajamas all day. This time, Michael's response was immediate and clear. Actually, Eliza runs a successful consulting firm that out-earns most people at this table, including me. Her work requires sophisticated business strategy and has helped her clients generate millions in revenue. I'm incredibly proud of what she's built. The conviction in his voice, the pride in his expression, the way he looked at me after delivering that response. It healed something in me that I hadn't even realized was broken. For the first time in our marriage, I felt truly defended and supported by my husband. Rebecca's expression during Michael's response was priceless. But more importantly, I realized that her opinion no longer held any power over me. The validation I had spent years craving from his family became unnecessary once I had it from the person who mattered most, my husband. This experience taught me profound lessons about boundaries and selective sharing that have transformed how I approach relationships. I learned that not everyone deserves access to your dreams, your struggles, or your successes. Some people earn the right to know the intimate details of your life through their consistent support and genuine interest. Others forfeit that, right through their judgment and dismissiveness. I still run my consulting business from our home office, but now I share my successes more freely with people who have proven they can celebrate them appropriately. I've built a network of fellow entrepreneurs, industry colleagues, and supportive friends who understand the challenges and rewards of building something from nothing. These relationships energize me in ways that trying to prove myself to skeptics never could. My business has continued to grow, partly because I'm no longer wasting emotional energy on seeking validation from people who were never going to provide it. That client Maya called about during the dinner, Pacific Northwest Innovations, became one of my largest accounts. And their success story has led to referrals that have doubled my revenue in the past 6 months. But perhaps the most important realization I've had is that my worth as a person was never dependent on my income level, my professional success, or anyone else's recognition of my achievements. I am valuable because I am kind, intelligent, creative, and caring. I contribute to my relationships and my community in countless ways that have nothing to do with business metrics or financial performance. The peace I've found in this understanding has been transformative. I no longer feel the need to prove myself to anyone, which paradoxically has made me more successful than ever. When you're not performing for an audience of critics, you can focus entirely on excellence and service. My relationship with Michael's extended family has settled into a comfortable distance. I attend family gatherings when I choose to, engage in conversations that interest me, and politely redirect or ignore comments that don't serve me. I've learned that you can maintain civility without sacrificing your emotional well-being. Though family I've created extends far beyond blood relatives now. It includes my clients who trust me with their business dreams, my fellow entrepreneurs who understand the unique challenges of building something new, my professional network who celebrate successes and provide support during difficulties, and the friends who see me clearly and value me completely. Michael and I have built the partnership I always hoped we could have. One based on mutual respect, genuine support, and the kind of love that shows up when it matters most. He's become my biggest cheerleader, my most trusted advisor, and my strongest defender. Our marriage is stronger now because we've learned to prioritize each other over external approval. That dinner 6 months ago forced all of us to confront uncomfortable truths about assumptions, respect, and the courage required to stand up for what's right. Not everyone rose to that challenge, but the people who mattered most did. And that has made all the difference. I've learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is set boundaries that protect your peace and your dignity. Sometimes growth requires uncomfortable conversations and difficult choices. And sometimes the family that matters most is the one you choose, rather than the one you're born into. Has life ever led you to create a family outside of blood ties? I'd really appreciate hearing your thoughts in the comments. Your stories matter. And if this journey touched something inside you, feel free to support the channel or pass this video along to someone who needs it.